You said that some of the different agencies are in lockstep, but also sometimes conflicting with each other. And there was an interesting bit of news around the GIU, I think, in the past few days. What's the dynamics there? When you say that they're kind of working against one another sometimes, the FSB is going up against the GIU, that's going against the MOD. Like, what's going on here?
If one looks at the pre-2022 situation, they were absolutely competitors in an often cannibalistic environment, in that they were notionally all good, loyal servants of the motherland and of Putin. In practice, they were all really competing for resources, for access to Putin, to be able to demonstrate to the boss that they are his bestest and most reliable spook. Since 2022, the dynamics got rather different. I think there's much less tolerance from the Kremlin for a sense of these kind of rivalries getting in the way of the collective job of fighting the war. A war not just against Ukraine, but against the whole collective West.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everybody. It's time for another episode into the state of Russia, into the state of Putin's mind, into the state of Russia's economy and the war in Ukraine. As you will know by now, last week has been a pretty eventful one for Vladimir Putin, and not in a way that he perhaps would have welcomed. And there's someone who I always pay attention to and what they're saying and their perspectives on the dealings inside the Slaviki, Putin's mindset, foreign policy, and that is Mark Galeotti, who we had on the show, about 18 months ago, when the channel was not even, I think, 10,000 subscribers big. So it's delightful to have him back. He is the executive director at Mayak Intelligence and also associated with the University College London. Goodness me, where to start with this week? Is this possibly the worst week Putin's had in the past 4 years of this war?
In some ways, to be honest, the worst week was the very, very first week of the war, which is really the point at which the war, as conceived at that time, was lost. But nonetheless, this is also pretty much up there. I think particularly for the whole pyrotechnic, quite literally, sort of nature of it. This is not something that is available to be parsed or whatever. Anytime people look at the umpteen videos and memes about that Kapotnia oil depot reservoir, with its roof blowing off, every time they go to a petrol station and find that they're being rationed or whatever, they know that something is happening. So in terms of the state's capacity to control the narrative, which has been one of its strengths through this war, I think that the lid has been blown off that quite as effectively as off Kapotnia.
No, nice little metaphor there. Yeah, no, I think it's coming apart at the seams, both the seams of the metal that was keeping the container in place, and his governance right now. But just to take a step back, in the more recent memory of this situation, we had the strikes in St. Petersburg and the International Economic Forum, which even my own dad, who is Russian, said that it's a bit of a joke, really. I'm kind of curious what you made of this year's.
In some ways, the forum has morphed the way that Russia's international economic and political relations have morphed, in that this is no longer so much Russia open for business as this is Russia essentially playing King Lear and looking for countries to demonstrate how much they are supportive of Russia. There were, clearly a lot of deals that were struck, but these were deals which anyway were in the pipeline, but were largely being held over to be struck at the forum. But of course, the international presence was, extensive, very much about the global south rather than anything else. We did have a small US delegation, first time in years, but it wasn't a deal-making delegation so much as a sort of symbolic one. But the main thing is, look, we've got a war economy that is really dominant in Russia, and it's not close to collapse or anything like that. But nonetheless, it's, you might say, an economy which is largely going to be defined by state interests, state contracts, and essentially a relative small number of state officials, rather than the old notion that actually business person shall speak unto business person. So I think it's compared with its old format, it's a very, very different beast. And, it wasn't a particularly impressive forum, but nonetheless, they had to have it.
I see. So it's more of a symbolic, just a routine at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many of these things that Putin has in a way already locked himself into. He has to do his big direct line, or these days, results of the year kind of marathon press conference come phone in. He clearly doesn't want to, but if he cancelled it without an excuse like COVID, then it would be a worrying symbol. Likewise, the Victory Day parade, they had to do it, obviously, even though it was a rather depressingly sad sham compared with previous ones. I think in so many ways, Putin has locked himself into things. And since he's not willing to just simply say, okay, yeah, I recognize things are going badly, that's why we're not going to do X or Y, he has to go through the motions, or rather his people have to go through the motions.
Well, that was the point I would ask, or for clarification, which is this at the behest of his inner circle, the elites, if you like, or is it the behest of the perception that the Russian people have of him, and he has to keep it up?
I mean, in a way, we're talking about the same thing. Look, I mean, obviously, narratives matter. How you present yourself, the confidence or the lack thereof that you manage to project to your own people and to your elites and so forth, as well as to the outside world, all of those matter. And therefore, in that context, whether it's people saying to Putin, boss, sorry, but you're really going to have to do it, otherwise it looks bad, whether it's Putin himself being fully aware of that, it's really a part of the symbiosis of politics, that those in charge always, even in an authoritarian regime, in some ways, especially in an authoritarian regime, have to think about the effect that they are having, the mood of the public, and what they're actually projecting. So this is admittedly tissue thin, but nonetheless an attempt to continue to project business as usual. Yes, we're in a war, but don't worry about it. It's not going that badly.
So now you have, as I said, someone who I know is good at calming the sensationalism or hysteria around the sort of idea that Putin is on the verge of being purged or ousted, and the Russian economy is about to collapse. You even alluded to it just a minute ago. So can you explain as to why that is? Because certainly things are getting worse, but I use the sort of concept of a slow-moving car crash, right? We're getting to a point of real situational crisis for the economy, but not one that is imminent.
Yeah, I mean, look, to start with the economy, because ultimately, in some ways, everything comes back down to the economy. I'm not an economist, but those who I listen to, who I think are worth listening to, essentially they talk about precisely the long-term scarring and in the short term, the increasing sort of dysfunctionality of much of the economy. But that's not the same as some kind of total systemic collapse. We're not going to see suddenly people no longer be able to buy food. We're not going to see a complete collapse with a sort of cascading bankruptcies of regions or these kind of other sort of catastrophic scenarios. What we are seeing is in some ways a accelerated version of what happened in late Soviet times, of in some ways an economy which is being badly managed, or at least sort of bad policy decisions being made at the very top. I mean, actually, the thing is that there's quite a lot of good management within the sort of the tactical level of the economy, with a disproportionately large share of the budget going on to defense and security, that is sliding down into shabby disrepair. But the point is, a lot of the things, they as I say, they're not going to be catastrophic impacts. I mean, if one thinks of, for example, the impact of underspending on infrastructure, on the healthcare system and the like, it's not though suddenly all the bridges collapse. It's that the time between repair extends. It's that the potholes that emerge in roads don't get filled as quickly as they ought to, with all the kind of consequent effects on haulage and the like. It's in terms of healthcare that there's a greater gap between deep cleanings, which means that more people are actually going into hospitals and then getting ill in hospital. But again, nothing dramatic. All of this actually has very serious long-term impacts, but that's it. And in terms of the movement against Putin, there's one thing this system is pretty good at. It's protecting itself. And there is no real means for people to convert their dissatisfaction into regime change, or at least presidential change, without going all in and essentially gambling that they can actually topple Putin. Now, Putin has a whole collection of interconnected and mutually suspicious security agencies that watch each other as well as watching the wider elite. There is no, ironically, to think that we might actually end up missing the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but at least the Communist Party did have much more of a structure and a kind of a collective esprit de corps and identity that could actually turn against the General Secretary, as Khrushchev found out in due course. The constitutional way of removing a president is incredibly complex. It basically requires you to get supermajorities in the State Duma, the Senate. You have to get it through the Supreme Court. These are all packed with Putin loyalists. And there's all sorts of ways of, frankly, impeding that process by making people vote the right way at bayonet point if need be. So I think from most people's point of view, what you're faced with is a situation with which you're very, very unhappy. There is no safe or even vaguely plausible way of actually removing Putin. You may try lobbying him into making the decisions you'd like to see, but that's about the best that you can do without actually risking everything with very little chance of success. So I think that's the situation. Now, of course, this will only really change, I would suggest, if there is a true existential threat to the elite. If we do see some kind of economic collapse, we see crowds out on the streets, we see the Amon riot police refusing to disperse them, that's the point where people might actually think at the moment, wow, we need to make a really tough decision. At present, though, it's too easy just to keep your head down and hope things work out. Or just hope that someone else deals with the problem instead of you.
Okay, so I want to pick you up on a few of those points. But firstly, when was the last time then you were personally in your time of following the country or following the Soviet Union, or perhaps just under Putin's leadership, were you like, wow, this is a genuine shock to the system? When the war fully took off, when the mutiny against Wagner was undertaking, the Georgian War in 2008, has there been any point where you were genuinely like, wow, this is the biggest destabilization to Putin's leadership? The Snow Revolution of 2011-12?
Look, I think that many of the things you mentioned, yes, the sort of the Snow Revolution, the Bolotnaya protests, they could have gone in a very different way. And they could have gone in a different way if frankly, if the protester leadership had been rather more united and thoughtful. But also, actually, one has to recognize that the authorities handled it well. By well, I mean in a competent manner. I'm minded of what happened when, for example, there were major protests in support of Boris Yeltsin, who was at that time the Russian leader, in spring of 1991, and the hardliners were encouraging Gorbachev to basically crack down. And it was Alexander Yakovlev, one of his liberal advisors, who said, look, if there's one protester killed, all of Moscow will turn out for that funeral. And so Gorbachev didn't sort of crack down at that time. That wasn't the only reason. But likewise, I think the authorities managed to handle this in a way that sort of brought it under control. So that would have been one. The very start of the war, it was a shock to the elite, and particularly when it was clear that this was not going to be a quick fait accompli. The Prigozhin mutiny, again, that was a fascinating one. Not because Prigozhin himself was either trying to topple Putin or he himself would do it, but what was fascinating was the response of the elites at the time. That, for example, if one looks even at the security elites, the forces along the route of march, as it was only really about a couple of thousand of Wagner soldiers were heading towards Moscow, weren't joining the mutiny, but nor were they doing anything really to stop it, except for the air forces. They were just willing to sit back and see what happens. Now, again, that could have been extended further if someone had thought this is a chance to strike. Since then, though, unfortunately, I think that the regime has learned quite a few lessons in terms of not just not giving any dodgy ex-con gangster oligarch his own private army, but more broadly about ensuring that, in a way, push doesn't come to shove, that it avoids those kind of crisis moments. So I think at present, in some ways, however uncomfortable it is, from the point of view of the sort of political managers of the system, slow, shabby decline is okay. And this is one of the reasons why I think this past week was so shocking, because it raised the prospect that, in fact, it could be something rather more rapid, rather more dramatic, that could affect the country, if this is just the harbinger of what is to come. I mean, we don't yet know whether or not this was a bit like, say, Operation Spiderweb, this extraordinary innovative use of drones to strike a whole bunch of Russian airfields, but essentially a one-off that had been a long time in the preparation. If we more or less see that every week we are having similar attacks on Moscow and elsewhere, then actually we're talking about a rather more rapid progress, which again begins to raise uncomfortable questions for an elite that doesn't want to have to answer that question.
Okay, so I want to go back to what you said about the elites and their relationship to Putin, and just simply their perspective on all the points that you've just mentioned. If they are the ones that can determine how much control Putin has, but Putin is also in charge, who really does have ultimate say? Or what is the system built around? Putin? Or if he is shown to be incompetent or just not doing what people are comfortable with, and the strikes continue in the regularity and intensity that you've just suggested they, hypothetically they could, at what point is Putin removed, or how does that work? And who replaces him? Or it's not that simple.
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of decision making, I mean, clearly Putin is the final decision maker on all the decisions that he wants to make. One of the things about Putin is, in many ways, he's quite a lazy autocrat, in that there are lots of issues he's perfectly happy to just staff out and dump on Prime Minister Mishustin, regional governors, other technocrats. And in particular, it tends to be the uncomfortable ones. He more or less bowed out of dealing with COVID. He retreated into his own biosecurity bubble and charged Mikhail Mishustin and Moscow Mayor Sobyanin with essentially sort of go out there and handle that through regional governors, which is one of the reasons why some regions did actually quite well and some regions did catastrophically badly. Likewise, we see in a whole variety of other issues, he sort of steps back. Macrofinance, I mean, he's relied so heavily on Elvira Nabiullina, the chair of the Bank of Russia. One of the reasons why her illness, what seems to have been absence because of illness for the last couple of weeks, was such a big deal. But nonetheless, there are other things where he absolutely wants to actually have the final say, and at present the system is such that he does. Of course, we're in a slightly kind of yes prime minister situation, in which often it's a question of who brings him the information, who brings him the options at his availability. And it is clear that there is an element of managing Putin that does go on, though he's also notoriously pricklish about any suspicion or sense of that. But yeah, okay, what happens if things go really badly? The honest answer is, I don't know. We don't know. There is a constitutional sort of framework, as I say, which could see Putin removed, at which point Prime Minister Mishustin becomes acting president and has to hold early elections. I don't think we can honestly say that the Putin regime operates in strict adherence to the constitution, though.
Lineage like that, no.
So I think it's unlikely. We would be in absolutely uncharted territory. And I can't help but think is, if I was going to be sort of playing the parallels, the closest I could imagine would be the August coup of 1991, when the conservatives, the hawks, turned against Gorbachev. That at some point Putin would just discover that, his phone's not connected. And he turns on the TV and hears that, an emergency commission is stepping in during the period of Putin's infirmity or illness. And that's the way it would happen. Now, of course, I don't think we could imagine huge crowds coming out on the streets to support Putin the way that they did against the August coup plotters. But conversely, it would be a really, really difficult operation to pull off. Remember, the 1991 August coup was to a considerable extent masterminded by the head of the KGB, Khrushchev. Whereas in this case, it would probably be against the interests of the security apparatus, against the people who are tapping the phone conversations, reading the emails, assiduously monitoring quite what the elite would do. We're in the classic first mover problem sort of territory. A lot of people might want to see Putin, whether it's deposed or just simply forced to adopt a different policy. But when it's incredibly dangerous, who starts those conversations? Who feels that they can trust other people enough to get them round a table and say, we've got to do something, and not think that one of them or one of the people serving them their brandy after dinner actually is then going to run to the FSB and say, you have no idea what's being discussed. So I think it would be a really difficult thing. And like I said, I think it's something that would basically emerge almost cobbled together ad hoc in a crisis situation rather than anything else.
Interesting. Now, you said that some of the different agencies are in lockstep, but also sometimes conflicting with each other. And there was an interesting bit of news around the GRU, I think, in the past few days. What's the dynamics there? When you say that they're kind of working against one another sometimes, the FSB is going up against the GRU, that's going against the MOD. Like, what's going on here in the context of the war as well?
I mean, I think, look, if one looks at the pre-2022 situation, they were absolutely competitors in an often cannibalistic environment, in that they were notionally all good, loyal servants of the motherland and or Putin. In practice, they were all really competing for resources, for access to Putin, to be able to demonstrate to the boss that they are his bestest and most reliable spooks. Since 2022, the dynamics got rather different. I think there's much less tolerance from the Kremlin for a sense of these kind of rivalries getting in the way of the collective job of fighting the war, a war not just against Ukraine, but against the whole collective West. And for me, I thought, one of the really telling points was when we saw recently, well, not that recently actually, the assassination of a helicopter pilot who had defected to Ukraine and then was given a new identity and a chunk of money and went to Spain. And he was, in due course, gunned down and run over by a car. Now, as near as I can tell, and this is still an open investigation, but talking to people who do have direct roles within it, this was carried out by local gangsters, Russian gangsters who are now resident in Spain. They were engaged to do it by the GRU, by military intelligence, because, the idea is, well, this was an army officer and therefore, we clean up our own messes. But that the FSB, that has the best connections to organised crime, not least because it is the dirtiest, the most corrupt of all the various security agencies, actually brokered the conversations that led to this contract being secured.
Right.
Now, in the past, you would not have seen the FSB and the GRU in any way sort of playing nice with each other. So, we do see that there is much more of a need because they ultimately, they are both probably genuine patriots in that they like their country to win, even while they're embezzling and engaging in their power struggles. But also, they're just aware that if it looks as if they are essentially impeding the overall sort of campaign of the country, then that goes badly for them. So there is still competition, but it's actually much more internal these days. You still see bitter rivalries over resources and perks and promotions within the agencies, particularly within the FSB, that is a real snake pit. And in fact, we've seen it interestingly with the arrest of Ilya Traber, this sort of 74-year-old criminal businessman in St. Petersburg. Apparently, this arrest was led personally by the first deputy head of the FSB, Sergei Korolyov, a guy who quite possibly indirectly was in business bed with Traber. So, one sees all kinds of different permutations, but as I said, they tend to be now within agencies rather than between them.
Okay, interesting. So that's the sort of security intelligence side. What of the recent shifts in the MOD? And there was this whole, I'll blend it in with that sort of idea that Shoigu was apparently overseeing some master potential toppling of Putin, which frankly I find ridiculous, knowing who Shoigu is as a person and his personal relationship to Putin. But what did you make of all that? And generally, how do you look at the state of the MOD, especially? The fact that we've got an economist in charge of it, doesn't that demonstrate that things are a little bit unpleasant or imperfect, at least?
Not really. I mean, first of all, yes, absolutely. The idea of Shoigu as the coup plotter was always a ludicrous one. But in terms of the appointment of an economist, Belousov, as minister, What it really reflects is the shift to a wartime status. I mean, technically, obviously, a special military operation status, but basically wartime footing, is that in peacetime in the Russian system, the minister is really the superior figure. The chief of the general staff is the minister's top soldier, the guy who's there to essentially make sure that the soldiers do their job. In time of war, though, actually, in many ways, the relationship gets reversed. The chief of the general staff becomes the key figure, and he reports directly to the supreme commander-in-chief, in other words, one Vladimir Putin. Whereas the minister really becomes the kind of quartermaster-in-chief. His job is to make sure that the military have the men, the equipment, the other resources that they need to fight the war.
Certainly.
And in that respect, essentially, it becomes a very much a managerial position and an economic managerial position at that. So I think, actually, Belousov wasn't a bad choice. He was a surprising choice. And in hindsight, it actually worked out quite well in that Belousov, first of all, isn't trying to throw his weight around. I mean, he comes in, he has no real team. If one looks at his deputy ministers, they're all in some ways representing some kind of external interest group, whether it's the defense industrial complex, whether it's Putin's own family, or whatever. So he's very much hemmed in, and yet he's doing the best of a bad job. He does seem to be trying to streamline what is, after all, a very inefficient, bloated, and deeply corrupted institution. And he has thrown his weight behind certain elements, like, for example, Rubicon, this kind of elite drone unit, which is very much in a way pushing innovation of Russian drone warfare. So, within those confines, he's actually doing a decent job. Of course, the problem is that this is in the context of continuing flows of money. What happens if the money can no longer be provided? And that therefore tough decisions need to be made. In some ways, there's a certain ease. When there's more money coming in, you're just simply deciding who gets a bigger slice of a bigger cake. When the cake starts to get smaller, then actually the minister's job becomes a lot harder. But also, actually, someday this war will end. And whether he'll be able to kind of reimpose the authority of the ministry over the chief of the general staff apparatus as a whole, that's another question. But that's a long way in the future. But I think it demonstrates the fact that really this is a war that is being fought and won on the basis of innovation and industrial capacity, rather than tactically on the battlefild. And that's why they felt that they needed a fairly statist economist, a man whose family background is in Gosplan, the old Soviet planning agency, to try and get some control over it in a way, because Shoigu was never that. Shoigu was a PR guy as much as anything else. He was a political operator, certainly not an economic manager.
Now, you used the word cannibalizing earlier, or cannibalistic, and that's a word that I used during another piece I put out at the beginning of the year, in the way that the economy seems to be going. And then The Economist ironically put something out about the death zone a few months ago. But you seem to not think that the economy is that bad. It's not great, but it's not imminently on the verge of no return. So why? If the economy is showing signs of cannibalism, surely that's a systemic problem that is hard to reverse.
It is. It's just that these kind of systems can last a long time in decline. There's a long way down to go, one could say. And the speed is such. Look, there's no way of getting around the fact that the damage that is being done to the Russian economy is very severe, and more to the point, is going to take a long, long time again after the war to recover from. That said, there is a fair amount of resource sloshing around the system. Authoritarian regimes, after all, can divert resources to where matters. So precisely, they can essentially make ordinary people pay the price of fighting the war. There's obviously, and again, I don't want to go too much out of my depth on the economy, but although the problem is for the Russians that they can't actually borrow on international financial markets, nonetheless, their level of debt is, certainly by Western standards, pitifully low. I think it's about 20%, whereas the UK is over 100% of GDP. I think that one can say that it's kind of cannibalizing itself the way that you might say, as human beings, if you are putting too much effort and you're not eating enough, your body will start to devour itself in the desperate quest for energy to keep you going. Well, that is what's happening to the Russian economy, I would suggest. It's a rather sort of facile parallel, but there you go. But it starts from a position in which it has a lot of resource, and it has the capacity to kind of modulate and control the speed and the level of decline. But the point is that at the same time, just as with the elite, actually doing something about it is a very dangerous thing. 2023 and 2024 saw people's quality of lives increase artificially because of high levels of defense spending, but nonetheless, people had more money in their pocket and were spending more. So it's not like they're yet at a point where they think it's been 10 years now and nothing is getting better. So there is still room for a little bit of optimism. And I think that's the point. That's what the Kremlin is gambling on.